Okay. Sense of taste or gustation is where we left off. Sense of taste or gustation. And where in the mouth do you have the most taste cells? Where in the mouth do you have the most taste cells? Is it on the tongue? True or false? False. About how many are on the tongue? About 4,000. Right? You guys are ready for Jeopardy, man. And everywhere else in the mouth is approximately what? 6,000. Look at you. Give me some attributes as we remind ourselves, some attributes about the sense of taste that you make decisions about before you decide to consume the food. What is that? Texture. Very good. In the back. Texture. What else? Bitterness. What else? What's that? Temperature. Very good. What else?
The way it looks.
What's the way it looks? Okay? So other than bitter, what would it be? What else?
Sweet.
Whether it's sweet. So it's taste, actually, right? And that's either going to be sweet, salty, bitter, sour, or what?
Umami.
Umami. Okay? And then next up, the transition to this lecture, what is another feature or aspect about that food that you're going to pay attention to?
The smell.
The way it smells. Now, our sense of smell is actually far more acute than our sense of taste. And what I mean by that word, acute, is it's sharper. We have a better ability to discriminate different types of chemical variations, right, which is the scientific way of smelling or tasting. Those are both chemoreception. Chemoreceptors are used for both the sense of taste or gustation and the sense of smell, or what we call olfaction. And it's far more acute or sensitive. We've got about 10 to 20 million olfactory cells. And on an average, we can distinguish not 5 chemical differences, but 2 to 4,000. So there are different variations of sweet. There are different variations of salty. There are different variations of bitter. Okay? And so this is the reason I talked about it last time we were together. When you have a head cold, right? One of you actually had a cold this weekend and said it was terrible. Okay? I was going to say it stunk, but you probably couldn't smell. So when you have a head cold and you can't actually detect olfaction, you can't pull odorants out of the environment, it affects the way food tastes because they're very intimately connected. And so we leverage the way that the food smells in order to give us a greater or a keener sense of taste. Okay, so it's kind of a big deal. The 10 to 20 million olfactory cells are set up very similarly. They're going to have supporting cells as well. We'll look at that. And they have a epithelial, and it's a moist environment. And why is it moist? What's that?
So it can dissolve. Doesn't it?
So what can dissolve?
The chemical.
The chemical. The odorant molecule, otherwise known as the chemical, can dissolve. Yeah, high five. High five your lecture study partner. Okay? So they must dissolve in fluid in order to be able to be detected, just like what we saw with taste. So the mucosa is wet. The mucosum of the superior conch, the nasal septum, and the roof of the nasal cavity is about 5 square centimeters. Now, instead of 5, we're orders of magnitude above that with 2 to 4,000 different odorants that we can actually distinguish. You can appreciate in this cross-sectional view, right? So we're cutting through the skull, and this is the olfactory mucosa that's actually being peeled back. So you can appreciate how the olfactory tract terminates to the olfactory bulb. Then you have this nerve fascicle that comes through the cribriform plate, and it's these endings of the neurons that are embedded into the mucosal layer. And that's where odorant is going to bind. So if we take a look at a more detailed view, we see what's shown in this particular slide. Now, the olfactory cells are neurons, and they have this sort of bowling pin shape. And so you can appreciate right here, this is a basal cell, and the purple cells are the supporting cells, and the olfactory cell is this sort of peach-colored bowling pin-like structure. Now, maybe you're like, well, that doesn't look like anything like a bowling pin color. Well, it's kind of thin at one end, thin at the other, and then kind of fat in one middle region of it. The head of the neuron has cilia, which we refer to as olfactory hairs. And there's about 10 to 20 per neuron. And these have a binding site for different molecules, and they lay in this layer of mucus, a thin layer of mucus. Now, of course, that layer of mucus thickens as you have a head cold, but the idea is that this thin layer of mucus is going to do a couple of things. It's going to actually trap a lot of dust and debris, and it's going to help filter the air as it enters into your nasal cavity. So if you're a runner, how many of you are runners, even just recreationally run? If you run, it's pretty warm right now, but if you wait until Friday when we got this cold front coming through, and you go run kind of at the low temp at night, and you take a deep breath in through your mouth, and you feel your chest, it'll feel definitely cold. And if you take a deep breath through your nose, and you bring it in, those nasal conch actually work like turbines, and they disrupt the airflow. The air comes through, and as it spins, it actually comes in contact with that mucosal layer, and that helps filter out the air. In addition to that, as it spins within the nasal conch, it actually warms and humidifies that air before you actually bring it into your chest cavity. So that's one of the purposes. You'll learn a little bit more about that next semester in respiratory phys in 202. For right now, what we are really focused on is it also encourages these odorant molecules, which are chemicals in the air, to actually get trapped within that mucus, dissolve out, and then be detected by the olfactory hair. Now, the basal end of each cell becomes an axon. So if you go from the cell here, this is the axon that runs right through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is one of the bones of the skull that you learned about this semester. And on the back end of that, you actually start to see how it terminates ultimately in this giant yellow structure is the olfactory bulb. And as it terminates onto the olfactory tract, and then that goes back into the brain. So these axons come through the skull via these little holes or these perforations in the ethmoid bone known as the cribriform foramen. The fascicles that all bundle together at the back ultimately make up cranial nerve number 1, which is also referred to as the olfactory nerve. So if we continue on, same picture, just on the different side, and we think about this organization, then we know that these neurons now exist as the only set of neurons in the body that are directly exposed to the external environment. Everywhere else, we either have some sort of tissue or connective tissue that's surrounding it. Okay? Even at the layer of the dermis, there's an entire layer of epidermis on top. But here within the nose, because it's covered, right, by our outer nasal cartilage and skin, and it's trapped within the nasal cavity, it is still in a protected environment, but it's actually contiguous with the outside environment. So this is the only spot in the body where you see neurons directly exposed to the outside environment. Okay, and that's the whole purpose of having a cover over top of these neurons. They have a lifespan of about 60 days. The basal cells divide. These basal cells, these smaller cells right here, divide, and they become these new olfactory cells. Just like what we saw with the stratum basale layer of the skin, just like what we saw or learned about just last week with the basal cells of the taste cells, right? So the taste cells have basal cells as well, and those turn over instead of every 60 days. How quickly do those turn over in the mouth? What's that? Every 7 to 10 days, every week to week and a half. Okay? These guys divide and are stem-like cell within the nasal cavity. Now, some of our factoids, as we wrap up smell and we move into the ear anatomy, humans have a relatively poor sense of smell when we compare it to other mammals. And there's been lots of discussion in the literature as to why we believe this is true. Is it that we've kind of selected ourselves away from it over time because it's fairly convenient? You look at a package now and you know if it's going to taste good or not, right? If you turn over the back of the package and you see an FDA stamp, then you know it's probably not poisonous. Okay, but that doesn't necessarily exist out in nature. And so a lot of other species have a much keener sense of smell, like our family dog. Women are more sensitive to odors than men. Okay, that's actually been demonstrated in the literature. And smell is highly important to social interaction. Think about the mammalian kingdom. Okay, so most of us all probably smell just fine. Okay, most. That's why I use the word most. Okay, I'm trying to be inclusive instead of exclusive there. But within the animal kingdom, okay, so take the family dog. The family dog, right? What's one of the most embarrassing things that happens when somebody comes to visit you? They smell their butt. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Appreciate just a shout out right there. Yeah, so the crotch-smelling animal in the house says hello to your neighbor, right? And it's super embarrassing. But if you remember back to the skin lecture, right? What type of glands do we have? If your armpit was closer to the floor, they would probably be just as interested, if it's not more interested, in your armpit as your crotch. Okay? What glands are there? Those sweat glands that release, right, fats and proteins. And those sweat glands release those fat and proteins, and the natural bioflora, or the natural microbiome, there's bacteria that live on our skin, right? It's a symbiotic relationship. And that bacteria that lives on our skin is actually fairly unique to you. So my bacterial signature is different than yours. And that bacteria is going to metabolize that fuel, which is in the form of lipid and in some cases protein, mostly the lipid. And then the waste product that the bacteria leaves behind is the odor that actually comes off of your body. And so your odor signature is unique to you. So your pet at home, your dog, knows it's you by the way you smell. Okay? And so you take your family dog for a walk, right? And you say hello to your neighbor, and you're exchanging pleasantries, and you're shaking hands, and you're saying hello. And maybe you don't know them that well, you ask them their name. And meanwhile, your dogs are smelling each other's back ends, right? And so we've developed this new discourse of shaking hands and speaking instead of smelling each other. But if we developed our skills like our dogs have, we wouldn't even need to say anything. We could just sniff around each other and know, oh, I know who you are. You live 2 houses down. Right? Kind of interesting. So it's critical to social interaction. You should try that. You guys should have an olfactory party, okay, at the break. Okay, no name tags, okay? Blindfolds, and just smell your way around the room and meet people. Kind of fun, huh? Yeah.
So since smell and taste are related,
I can't hear. Smell and taste are related. Yeah, sorry.
does that mean that since dogs have a better sense of smell, that their taste is better than ours as well?
Yeah, the overall interpretation is going to be more significant. Now, they don't take as much time to taste. You don't see a dog kind of palate their food, swish it around, and kind of decide if it's worthy of ingesting. Usually in one breath, it's like down the hatch. But they smell it before. But once they've smelled it, their satisfaction in their limbic system is highly tied towards the smell. Okay, and once they've smelled it and had that pleasure center stimulated that this is going to be good for me, then the tasting is sort of a rubber stamp. It's kind of beside the point. So they usually won't consume it unless they've already smelled it. Okay, they'll smell it first. So it's more important or valuable for them to actually smell. And we just don't take the time to do that. Okay? I use a silly interaction or a silly example of this, olfactory party. But if you think about the way that we do things, the way other mammals do it, we're designed very similarly, but yet we execute very differently. Okay? But it's still critical to our species. Right? There's a whole industry centered around making you smell good. Right? And so you can go to the store and find all sorts of different smells that you could actually incorporate and say, this is going to be my scent. Okay? This is how they will know me. Okay? And you mask yourself with this commercial, capitalistic bottle of odorant molecule. But you can't fool your dog. Okay? No matter how much of that stuff you put on, he or she will still know that it's you. Right? And they'll be like, you smell really stinky, but I know it's still you. All right, these odorant molecules, they're binding to these receptors. And if these odorant molecules are hydrophilic, then they go right through the mucus. If they're hydrophobic, then they have to be transported by an odorant binding protein within the mucus. And they take a little longer. So hydrophobic signals usually come on at a lag. You detect that smell a little later, and then it fades. It lasts a little longer. Whereas hydrophilic odorant molecules, you'll smell real quickly, and then they kind of subside aggressively. You utilize these second messenger systems like G proteins and cyclic A&P in order to propagate that action potential. And what happens is channels for either sodium or in some cases calcium, depending upon the odorant molecule, is going to cause the depolarization of the membrane. The channels open and sodium rushes in, just like what we saw before in our previous lectures. And then that action potential travels directly to the brain. The olfactory receptors adapt very quickly. We call this process synaptic inhibition. So the example that I'll use there is, if you walk into a room and there's a bad smell or a good smell, let's say this is the time of the year where people are really lighting all these candles. Right? It's pretty popular. You go into somebody's home and there's some sort of like cinnamon spice, or it was pumpkin spice last month, but that's like way out now. You shouldn't be burning that anymore, apparently. I only know that because I did that this weekend and I was told that we're beyond pumpkin spice. But it was still there, so I just lit it, right? But the season of pumpkin spice has left the building, just so you guys are aware. I want to make sure you guys understand that so that you are more knowledgeable than I am. But we're in the season, you walk into the room, and maybe there's a cinnamon spice smell in the room. Okay? Or a peppermint smell in the room, and it's very strong. Well, you're in there, you're cooking, or you're hanging out, and after a while, you don't even smell it. Somebody walks in the room and goes, whoa, what's burning in here? Okay? So this is known as synaptic inhibition, where you kind of reset your olfactory receptors, and you become desensitized to it. Now, some odorants, and the odorants that we'll use as examples, will stimulate nociceptors of the trigeminal nerve. Trigeminal nerve within that nasal epithelium. Ammonia, menthol, chlorine, hot peppers, the pacin of hot peppers, all will stimulate. And if you've ever had like a really hot dish or hot sauce that was too spicy and the nose just starts burning, those are nociceptors that you're actually detecting. Some of you are like, yes, I just say more. Give me more of that. Okay? All right. Questions on smell. So smell and taste are very intimately related, very, very closely tied. And the last little thing that I want to say about the sense of smell is I want to remind you of the fact that we mentioned earlier in the semester. The sense of smell is very closely tied to memory, long-term memory. So we look at the neuronal pathways of smell. They go into a vast number of different centers. And one of the centers that they hit is the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is a component of the brain that's responsible for converting short-term memory to long-term memory. Okay? And so many of you can think back to a very fond childhood memory. And if you think about it, you can probably not spend a whole lot of time and remember there was a smell that might remind you of that. Okay? Where there's like apple pie. Okay? Or maybe it's bacon because, you know, like your grandma lived with you and she was from the Midwest, and so there was bacon and eggs for every breakfast, right? Now you just wish grandma lived in your dorm room because you don't hardly ever have breakfast because you're waking up and running to class. But bacon might remind you of grandma for some strange reason. You don't want to tell anybody because that's like a weird connection, but that's why, okay? It goes the opposite. There's certain colognes or perfumes that you can't stand, right? Because that was like, you know, your girlfriend from junior year of high school, and she dumped you, and so like you cannot handle that scent anymore. So there are favorable smells. I mean, that was just a random example I'm saying, but there are good memories and there are poor memories. A lot of times they're tied to some specific smell. Yes.
Are all the smells genetically like embedded in your system, or is it all just different, I guess, variations of different smells that causes so many other smells to come out of it, like kind of blending?
Yeah, so it's the latter of the two. You know, so there's, you know, there are capabilities of essentially creating or inventing new smells. If that's what kind you're asking is, you know, you have these pathways that detect certain odorant molecules, but if there's a new odorant molecule that has affinity for multiple receptors, then it's going to light up new pathways that you've never smelled before. And you know, you might have that experience sometime. You know, it's like if you have fortunately avoided broccoli your whole life and you have no idea what it smells like, someday, okay, you're going to be married and forced to eat it again, and then you'll remember what broccoli smells like. You'll be like, wow, that's a pathway I haven't used for like, you know, 40 years, and now I'm eating broccoli every day. Okay? And so, again, and that brings a memory up, right? Broccoli is a fond memory. No, I'm just kidding. But there are definitely pathways that don't get triggered that you never use, and then you're exposed to a new scent or a new molecule, and it may light up new pathways that you've never actually used before. Okay, so let's shift gears to hearing. This is our third special sense, but within the ear there are two special senses that we're going to cover today. There's hearing, and there's equilibrium, or what we call balance. Now, hearing and equilibrium. Right? Hearing is a response to the vibration of air molecules. So as I'm speaking, because there's a environment, there's a density of air here, as I speak, I'm sending out vibrations through the air. And those air molecules are moving. Now, we can't necessarily see that visibly, but what we could see is if you change the medium. If you change the medium to water, and if you imagine a pond, a nice, calm pond, and you take a rock and you throw it into the pond, and it makes this ripple, and the waves, the mechanical waves that are radiating out from that center point are your visible interpretation of how these sound waves are making it from my mouth to your ear. Okay? Now, the converse is if you take the environment or the media out, like what you would see in a vacuum or experience in a vacuum, then there's no sound travel because there's no ability for waves to be made. Right? So there's no sound that travels in space in a vacuum. Right? So the new Star Wars is coming out. I'm hoping that all of the blasters are going to be silent because that's more accurate. And those TIE fighters sound really cool, but they don't sound like that. There's no air. Just saying. Okay, so that's kind of boring if we made a movie like that, so they have to be incorrect. But the reality is, vibrating air molecules is how we hear. So equilibrium now is the sense of motion or body orientation and balance. And both of these special senses rely within this structure, deep within this structure. What we see is just the outer ear. Right? And the outer ear's function is to help funnel those sound waves to make it down to the middle ear. And then in the middle ear we have 3 bones that you learned about in lab, just like in the last couple of weeks. 3 smallest bones in the body, and they are organized very specifically where one moves, it hits on the other one, and the third one moves, and it pushes on a window. And that's about maybe as far as you got in lab. And so we're going to talk about all the mechanisms of how we hear in this lecture. Both senses reside in the inner ear. And true to my analogy, my Star Wars analogy, there has to be some sort of medium in order for the vibrations to travel. And so the inner ear decides to use fluid. So we're interacting in an air environment. And it converts from an air environment to a mechanical movement and then to a fluid, ripples in the pond example. So the inner ear is a maze of fluid-filled passages that allows for these vibrations to move through. The fluid is set in motion, and that motion then is detected by the deflections of different hair cells as the fluid pushes on them. And then that's going to open a channel, ions are going to flow in, and you're going to get an action potential. Okay? So we kind of need to fill out the details, but here's what this typically looks like in a cartoon drawing. So here's our outer ear, and this is actually sound waves that are traveling in air. The middle ear, where the 3 bones are located, is also an air environment. And so sometimes this air environment is at a different pressure than this air environment, like when you move from Phoenix to Flag on I-17. And so you sit there saying, you know, my ears are all plugged up. What's happening is you get this pressure differential between the middle ear and the outer ear. And so what you do is you actually yawn and you allow for equilibrium of the pressures to take place because you allow for atmospheric air to come in through this auditory tube. That auditory tube is connected to where? Where's that auditory tube connected? To the back of the throat. Right? So some strategies are chewing gum or yawning, right? And some people, you look back and what are you doing? I'm trying to pop my ear, or I'm like, wow, Alex, here, have some gum. That's weird. So that's what that yawning or that, equilibrium, and then you feel your ears pop because you're equilibrating the pressure between the inside and the outside. Now, if you have an ear infection, or if you have a sore throat, if you have a cold, and they stay plugged up, a lot of times there's a lot of inflammation or fluid that gets trapped here, and so this won't drain, and that's why you have sort of this constant, my ears feel like they're full of fluid. Okay? Then on this side, there is fluid, but this is always here. And this fluid is contained. This fluid is contained, and here is a second membrane. This is our eardrum right here, or what we refer to as our tympanic membrane. Our secondary tympanic membrane is found on the other side. So sound itself, we're going to go through sound first, and then we'll move into equilibrium towards the end of the lecture. And then I have something for you, so you're going to want to stick around. Sound. These are audible vibrations of molecules. So again, the vacuum environment of space, there's no sound that actually travels. If you explain that opening night, you'll probably get thrown out of the theater. So I'd probably save that for your Christmas party or your holiday party, and use that as sort of a Jeopardy trivia idea. You'll be much more popular than if you explain it in opening night of Star Wars. But these are vibrating molecules of air that we're detecting. Pitch is the treble or the bass, how high or how low. It's the frequency at which it resonates. and it's measured in hertz. And another interpretation of hertz is cycles per second. Cycles per second, that's hertz. And then loudness. Loudness is the intensity or the amplification of the sound or the vibration that's taking place. And this is measured in decibels. Now, if we look at a different cartoon drawing, which is a little bit more real to life, we see our outer ear, we see our middle ear, and then we see our inner ear. The border, and this is important for the worksheets and the quizzes, because there's a question on this. The border of the middle to outer ear is the eardrum, or the tympanic membrane. The border for the middle ear to the inner ear is actually the oval window, which is the secondary tympanic membrane. The secondary tympanic membrane is on the other side of this bone known as the stapes. The stapes is like a plunger. You see how it's kind of got a handle? And it's like a plunger. As it pushes, it's going to force that window in, and as it comes out, it's going to force that window out. So that membrane is going to kind of do like this. Kind of like you imagine a plunger going in and out. Okay, so this is the outer ear that consists of our helix and our auricle, and then the auditory canal. And this funnels sound, and that sound is converted to a mechanical vibration at the eardrum. And as the eardrum vibrates, on the other side it's connected to the malleus, which is the first middle ear bone. The malleus is physically connected to the incus, and this one pushes on this one, and this second one, the incus, is physically connected to the stapes. And that's the final middle ear bone that's kind of shaped in an architecture like a plunger. And the plunger part is the oval window, or our secondary tympanic membrane. Now, if we take a look at sort of the components of the inner ear, because that was the outer and the middle. The inner ear is on the other side, like I said, of the oval window, and it's made up of these bony labyrinths, or these bony canals. And these bony canals either have these semicircular ducts, or it has this cochlea that looks like the back of a snail. And we're going to look at these semicircular ducts as it relates to equilibrium and balance. And then we'll look at the cochlea as it relates to hearing. So the cochlea and information that's transferred to the cochlea is connected to the cochlear nerve. And information that comes from the semicircular ducts is connected to the vestibular nerve. And we know that the vestibular nerve and the cochlear nerve merge to form what nerve? The vestibular-cochlear nerve. It's not your question. Okay? So you remember this vestibular-cochlear nerve that has sort of a funky name? It's because it's where the cochlear nerve and the vestibular nerve join and actually transmit a single signal to the brain. Okay? Now, if we continue on the parts of the inner ear, we're unfolding. Here is our oval window. So if I back up, the oval window is on the other side of the stapes. The stapes is missing here. Now you see the oval window. And this is the cochlea. And here, this small little box is blown up right here. And this is a cross-section. You see the green matches the green, the blue matches the blue, and then the green matches the green. And so if we look at this architecture, it's as if you have you ever made cinnamon rolls? I think we've used this example before, like when we were doing myelin. So if you have a cinnamon roll and you have the ability to unroll it, right, it would be a kind of a longer piece of dough. And if you imagine this is, kind of looks like a cinnamon roll, right here. And if you were to unroll it, you would imagine a tube on top, right? A tube in the middle, and then a tube on the bottom. And as we roll it up, and you cut it in cross-section, this is what you see. Make sense? So the tube on top is called the scala vestibuli, and it actually has within it perilymph. Perilymph. Now, perilymph is a fluid, and this fluid is very similar to the extracellular fluid. And so it's going to be rich or high in sodium, just like the extracellular fluid, the ECF, has high sodium levels. Right? You open a channel in a normal cell, and sodium rushes in, right? And that causes an action potential. So the scala vestibuli, as well as the scala tympani, are both colored green conveniently because they both circulate perilymph, which is a fluid. It's not green, it's a clear, colorless fluid, but it's high in sodium. And then there's what we call a vestibular membrane between this top tube and the middle tube. And the vestibular membrane creates this border between the top tube and the middle tube. And the middle tube is called the cochlear duct. The cochlear duct is a duct with a colorless, odorless fluid that's high in potassium. Potassium is the main ion in endolymph. Endo meaning inside. And so endolymph inside resembles intracellular fluid, which is also high in potassium. And we learned that this semester. And then we see this structure that we'll look at here in a second, but there's this additional membrane here. And this membrane at the bottom is called the basilar membrane. And the basilar membrane separates the cochlear duct from the scala tympani, which is now again full of perilymph, which is high in sodium, resembling extracellular fluid. Now, if I blow up this box and I look at it over here on the left, we can see a couple of structures. Here's our basilar membrane, which is the border between the scala tympani down here and the cochlear duct. Here is a structure that has cells that have hair cells and then these other cells which are called supporting cells. Now, if you'll notice, there aren't any cells here that actually resemble or are labeled basal cells. You see that? So what does that tell you about the receptor cells of the inner ear? What's that? They're amitotic. Do they turn over? No. So once this hair cell is destroyed or damaged or its lifespan is over, there's no replacing it. Right? Now, when we saw this architecture in smell and olfaction, or smell and taste, olfaction and gustation, we saw that there was a turnover of these sensory cells. Right? 7 to 10 days in taste, about 60 days for smell. Well, there are no stem-like cells in the inner ear. So if you lose them, you don't regenerate those cells. So if a patient has damage to the hair cells, then they're not going to be replenished. You're like, wait a second, I went to a concert, I couldn't hear it, and like 3 days later I could hear it. And well, there's a lot of other things that could have happened. But the hair cells themselves were probably not destroyed. Okay, we can talk through like what ifs all day long. Okay, we'll talk about some of them. So hold off some of those questions. But the supporting cells offer nutritional support, and these structures are called hair cells. Inner ear hair cells. And they have these stereocilia, and these stereocilia are stuck and embedded in a membrane. And that membrane that's on top is called the tectoral membrane. Okay? So here's what's going to happen when you hear. You're going to get vibrations. Let's back up. You get air vibrations coming down. It's going to mechanically move the eardrum. That's going to push on the malleus, which pushes on the incus, which pushes on the stapes. The stapes is going to move the second eardrum, which is known affectionately as the oval window. Now, the oval window, on the other side of it, is a chamber or a tube full of fluid. So now the movement of the window is going to cause ripples in the perilymph. As the perilymph ripples or pressure is put within that fluid. That puts pressure on the vestibular membrane. That membrane moves. That pushes pressure on the endolymph. That fluid moves. That pushes pressure on the basilar membrane. That's the bottom of this structure. As the basilar membrane moves, those hair cells are going to be going up and down or back and forth. And they're stuck within a tectoral membrane. And as they move, it pushes on that tectoral membrane. Okay? All right, I got all that. But wait a second, now what? Okay, well, we got to finish this off by going into our second segment here. So this is kind of what we just talked about, but just in a different way. Right? We've got our air molecules vibrating. We have our eardrum or our tympanic membrane vibrating. We've got our three middle ear bones moving, pushing on our secondary tympanic membrane, also referred to as our oval window. And then the fluid moves. And as the fluid moves in this top row, that's consistent with our scale of vestibuli. Okay? So that pushes pressure in this fluid, which vibrates and moves the vestibular membrane. That vibrates and moves the fluid within the cochlear duct, the endolymph. Again, that vibrates and moves the basilar membrane. And the basilar membrane has embedded within it these inner ear hair cells. And those are stuck into a tectoral membrane. And so this action is happening. Now, if we blow that up at higher magnification, right, these are our stereocilia, right? And they're stuck within a tectoral membrane. So and this is another blow-up diagram right here. And that's this box right here. Notice the fluid here is blue because in this previous picture, we're looking at endolymph, which is blue. You guys following? So if we're looking at blue endolymph and we zoom in and we see that the tip of that hair cell has a little protein that's attached to it, and that little protein is referred to as a tip link. And that tip link is a fibrous protein, you can see, that links one hair cell, stereocilia, to the next. And what it's connected to is actually a potassium channel. And so as the tip link, as the stereocilia bend, the tip link actually is stretched. It opens the channel, and because we're in endolymph, which resembles intracellular fluid, high in potassium, we actually get an influx of potassium in this example, instead of what we've been learning about all semester, sodium coming in. But it does the same thing. It's +1, just like sodium's +1, right? Some of you have been in my office all semester like, well, why is it sodium? Well, because it's extracellular fluid. It could have been any other positively charged ion. But your outside cellular environment is a saline environment. Your cells like to live in a saline environment, which is sodium chloride. Well, sodium chloride will readily dissociate the free sodium and free chloride ion. And if you look back at your old notes, you see that there's high sodium outside the cell and there's high chloride because there's saline out there. Well, we're inside the cell, remember? We're in endolymph. And so instead of sodium, we don't have sodium high. We actually have high potassium. So when this gate opens, potassium comes in, but it causes a depolarization just like sodium did in the muscle and in the nerve physiology lectures that we learned about all semester. So it's kind of a cool way to wrap up the semester by talking about some of the review concepts, because you're seeing a lot of the motifs that we've learned about all semester repeat themselves. But here, instead of influx of sodium, we see an influx of potassium. But if you think about where we are, it makes a lot of sense. Now, here is a weird picture. But this is a picture of this cochlea unwound. Okay? Stretched out. And as it's stretched out, you can kind of appreciate that the top tube, the scale of vestibuli, Well, it can send vibrations down into the cochlear duct, the blue tube, which is full of endolymph, like we talked about. And then that can send vibrations down into the bottom tube, which is connected to the basilar membrane by the scalets and panning. Well, once it vibrates in the scalets and panning, if you think about that ripple effect of a rock in a calm pond, once the first wave gets to the edge of the pond, what happens? If it's a rocky shore and not a soft sand shore, it's going to bounce back, right? And then you actually start getting interference of your nice, beautiful ripples because you're getting reflection of those waves. So the way the inner ear is built is there's a secondary tympanic membrane down here. It allows for the absorption of those leftover ripples so you don't get this echoing. Isn't that nice? Nice. Right? Otherwise, this is how lecture would be every week. Kind of weird. So if we go back to this picture, here it is. Right? It's called a round window in this slide. That round window prevents this from happening every time we talk. Okay, so if we go forward, we can kind of appreciate now this secondary tympanic membrane right here, okay, is allowing for the absorption of those leftover waves. Now, not all of the waves vibrate this direction because it's not completely efficient. Right? You drop a rock in a pond and you can kind of predict where the waves go, but you see sort of rogue waves, right? Because they make their way around kind of rocks or structures. So at the helicotrema, this is where the scale of vestibuli actually meets the scalets and panning. And so if this vibrates down at the other end, it's not going to hit the end and bounce back. It's going to circulate around and then be absorbed by our secondary tympanic membrane. Okay, so that's built in. This next diagram down here, this is actually showing where we perceive the different frequencies. So the low frequencies are at the distal, right? Further away. And the high frequency sounds are at the basal end, right? And then our mid are kind of right in between. So if we look to our frequencies of the proximal or the basal end, right? Proximal or basal end, this is nearest to our oval window, right? So proximal, basal end, that's nearest to the oval window, these are our high frequency sounds. If we look at our distal, further away, this is our low frequency sounds. And you can see the hertz, 20 to 800 on the low frequency, and then 7,000 to 20,000 on the high frequency. And that's about the range of human hearing, is 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. Okay? Now, if you can imagine organisms like the family dog, they can hear frequencies beyond that, right? So they have a much more pronounced cochlea. It's a larger structure given the size of the organism. And there's more real estate if you unwind it, allowing for a wider range of frequency detection. Right? So a dog whistle is a very high frequency pitch, beyond 20,000 hertz, that we can't hear, because we cannot detect it based upon our anatomy. Now, the distal end, right, is also referred to as the free end. And the proximal end is referred to as the attached end. What does that mean? Well, it's attached here at the oval window, and the free end is kind of the end that kind of ends up further away from where the sound begins. Now, if we look at different types of deafness, this always tends to be kind of a question about, what about deafness and what happens? Well, we've got two main types that I want to characterize, and the way I want to organize this particular slide is if you see This is dividing at the other side of the stapes. Right? The oval window. So it's the middle ear and the outer ear. This green shaded box. Do you see that? It kind of looks like a green arrow going that way. And then it's sitting inside of a sort of magenta or pink shaded region that's signifying the inner ear. So if we have conductive hearing loss, this is when it's a problem with something within this area. If it's sensorineuronal, then it's on the other side of the window. So conduction deafness, this would be things like overproduction of wax in the ear canal, or a blockage. A ruptured eardrum, or tympanic membrane, is another name for the eardrum. Otitis media. So otitis media is where you get fluid building up within that middle ear. Or otosclerosis is where you get hardening of the ear bones. And the stapes, the incus, and the stapes, the incus, and what's the third one?
Malleus.
What's that? Malleus, thank you. The stapes, the incus, and the malleus actually sort of fuse. That would be otosclerosis, where you're getting those bones kind of fusing together. The sensorineuronal, a lot of the sensorineuronal ones are going to happen at the inner ear, and they're usually not reversible. The conduction problems are usually treatable. Now, sensorineuronal is not untreatable, but it's less likely to be treated because a lot of times it's due to damage to the hair cells. Okay? Those hair cells actually either don't form, or the hair cells get dislodged from the tectoral membrane, or the tip link is not formed, or the cochlear nerve never connects. Okay? All of those would be sensorineuronal types of deafness. Now we have ear implants, inner ear implants, that you've probably seen and you didn't know what they were. Okay? They kind of look like someone's wearing a hearing aid, but it's not positioned. You're like, it's not really in the right spot. In fact, it's like it's up here. So what's happening is it's a device that's collecting sound waves, and it's creating an electrical signal, just like what we do, and it's transmitting it down a wire, and that wire is usually connected to the cochlear nerve. And so it's operating like your hearing organ. And the hearing organ, I forgot to mention, is referred to as the organ of Corti. We're moving away from these people nomenclatures, but it's called the hearing organ or the organ of Corti. C-O-R-T-I. Okay? So, sensorineuronal is now become treatable, but it wasn't treatable but within the last 10 years. Okay? And sometimes, depending upon how long ago they had their implant, they might be shaved at that spot. They might just keep it very short so that when they go in to have it looked at, it's easy to access. Okay? But that's what you're seeing. And usually they're up about right here. And they're kind of, not, it's not like a Bluetooth and it's not a hearing aid. It's sitting up here and it's usually a little bit more round or oval-like. And those are organ of Corti or hearing organ implants.
So that's why only some people can get cochlear implants, because it's like
Yeah, it depends on what the deafness issue is. Okay, so if the nerve itself is not intact, a lot of times the implant won't work. Okay, but if it's truly a hair cell and everything else is there, then they can bypass that and they can go straight into the cochlear nerve and send the signal. It's just an electronic signal, or an electrical signal. That's all action potentials are. Right? So our engineers have figured out a way to send the appropriate millivolts to the cochlear nerve to interpret different frequencies of sound. Right? It's an electrical engineering senior design project, in my opinion. Right? That's kind of a joke, but it's definitely doable. You're seeing way more of these kind of crazy things happening nowadays. Okay, so this slide is to summarize hearing and where all this stuff goes. Because you've got this picture down here where you've got the cochlea coming in. This is, the cochleal nerve is feeding into where the vestibular nerve connects, and the vestibular cochlea nerve, known as cranial nerve 8, actually is entering in to the cochlear nucleus, right? And as it moves into the cochlear nucleus, then it sends it up to the inferior colliculus. And then we send information out through the thalamus, which is our relay center, and we go over to our primary auditory cortex, and we may send it to other locations like even the hippocampus for memory. Okay? So the last part of the inner ear is equilibrium, and it's actually rather simple. It is organized, so we were over here, now we're over here, and we've got these 3 rings, or canals. And we've got 2 main structures. We have what we call our vestibular apparatus, which is our semicircular ducts, or our canals, and they're going to give us information about angular acceleration. Angular acceleration is information like when you rotate. Okay? When your car makes a turn around a corner, it's going to create an angular acceleration. And you know that. You could be driving in a car, and with your eyes closed, okay, or blindfolded in the trunk, just for example, and you know when you take a turn. Like you could count the turns. Like, that was a right turn. That was a left turn. That was a right. And you could text 2 rights and a left. You know, I don't know where I'm at. It's Flagstaff, so I'm probably in Winslow already. The saccule and the utricle. This is giving you information about static equilibrium or linear acceleration. So like when you take off at a stoplight. So again, sort of the weird example of being blindfolded in a trunk. You would know when you were stopped and when, oh, we're moving again, right? So that's your saccule and your utricle. Now, how do these things work? Well, the saccule and the utricle, this is our macula utriculi, and this is our macula sacculi. They're located in sort of these anterior chambers before you get to these semicircular ducts. So if we blow this up and we look at what's going on here, it looks a lot like the hearing organ, like the organ of Corti. But what's different about it is we've got our hair cells coming up, and instead of being embedded in a tectoral membrane, they're in what's called an otolithic membrane, which is kind of like they're stuck in jello. And that jello is the kind that Grandma used to make that has like the fruit inside of it. You know, like cherry and pineapples, and some of you are like, ooh, and some of you are like, yeah, I love that stuff. Right? And the reason it has these crystals known as otoliths, and these are calcium carbonate crystals, is it actually increases the weight or the mass of the membrane. And so what happens as information is happening, so for example, if we're looking at the macula utriculi or the macula sacculi, when we're in this position, we see that they're standing straight up. But when we get into this position, we see that the membrane actually sags, and it pushes those hair cells down. That opens a channel, allows for ion flow to move in, and that causes the action potential. And then you interpret a change in position. Okay? The next example is our semicircular ducts, these 3 chambers. They just happen to be sort of an X, Y, and a Z orientation. I don't think it's just they so happen to be. That gives you angular information in the X plane, the Y plane, and the Z direction. So you can get 3-dimensional angular information. And this is pretty important. I mean, if any of you were circus acrobats, how many were circus acrobats? Really? One of you? Wow, that's amazing. I was trying to pick a very outlandish example, but one of you, oh, you're just kidding? Oh, so it was a good example. If you were a circus acrobat, the N of 1 in the room, or maybe gymnastics, okay? Maybe you were a diver, okay? Or even a swimmer, right? How many times have you tried to practice the kick turn and hit your head on the bottom? I mean, I did that like a million times when I was a kid. Okay, the kick turn and like scrape your face. What happened to you? I was doing kick turns in the pool. Man, you should wear a helmet when you swim. So the semicircular ducts, these have endolymph inside. Okay? As the endolymph, you can see it's blue, This is organized, the sensory fibers are organized into a jello cap. And this is where they're embedded as the crista ampullaris. And as the endolymph swirls, like if you spin in place and the endolymph is swirling, when you stop, I don't know why I'm demonstrating it because you can't feel the dizziness that I feel right now, but you know what I'm talking about. You stop and it feels like you're still moving. What's happening is that fluid is still circulating around and then it kind of slows down. And as it's moving, it's pushing over the crista ampullaris, or this cupula, and that's deflecting the hair cells, opening a channel allowing for potassium to move in, and that causes the action potential. And if it's done in this chamber, that's Y. If it's done in this chamber, that's in the X direction. If that's this chamber, it's in the Z direction. Okay? So it gives us information, valuable information, about angular acceleration. Now, the last slide for today, staying here because I've got something for you, is showing sort of this complexity of all the different centers. All of these centers are places we've been this semester. All these centers are places we've been this semester, and to prove it to you, let's just walk real quickly through it. So we've got our vestibular information coming down the vestibular-coccular nerve, right? Going into kind of the bottom portion of the brain, near the brainstem, into our vestibular nuclei. We send dual information. We send information to the nuclei for eye movement because as you're spinning, you're trying to get your bearings. Right? We had the Nutcracker performance, and I have 2 ballerinas, and so, you know, we watched lots of Nutcracker over the years. Well, it always amazes me when I'm watching these athletes perform, and believe me, ballet is an athletic performance. As they're spinning on the floor, on the dance floor, I'm surprised they don't, A, fall over and B, vomit. Okay? And then my daughter said, Dad, a little girl vomited this time. I'm like, oh, really? She's like, yeah, I was in the grand finale. I was like, oh, well, at least she was behind somebody. You know, so you didn't see it. I was like, yeah, she got all dizzy. And because the eye movements here that you're compensating for need to actually be centered. Okay? So here's our nuclei for eye movements. Then we go to the thalamus. Remember that thalamus, that relay center? It's going to go everywhere from here. We go to the vestibular cortex so you can get information about where I am. Okay? And this is how you hear, and this is how we keep balance. Questions on this? Okay, stick around. I'm going to turn this off.